Okay, we'll go to questions, comments, suggestions from the members, beginning with Senator Wolk.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Welcome to the legislature.
Thank you.
Mr. Picker, I have a number of questions. I'm the chair of the subcommittee on budget, and we'll see each other again in the spring. I want to start with the issue of safety. I appreciate your focus on safety and when you were talking about the railroads in particular. With the changes in, with the fact that the oil pipeline, which was proposed, the Keystone Pipeline, is not going to be built, I feel, and from what I'm reading, there will be an increase in the number of trains that will be coming through California and many places, including right in the heart of my district, through my district, with cars that may or may not be up to the kind of standard that the president has asked for, over bridges that probably haven't been inspected as often as I would like. So my question to you is how you're beginning to prepare for that, carrying a load that is extraordinarily volatile. I mean, clearly, this is a different kind of crude and presents certain problems. So when you talk about rail safety, what plans are you making to deal with that change which is happening?
I'm going to just point to a couple things, but I may ask Lisa Malashenko to speak a little more on it. First, I'm going to say I think you're right. It's a serious threat, and it's likely to grow. Currently, there aren't a lot of refineries in California that are prepared to take that very volatile light fraction of oil. They need to change the structure of their distillation columns and their piping before they can actually process large amounts of it. But we know that it's going to grow. We know we were able to actually identify the first crude oil from the Bakken that came in because of the location it went to. And the reason we know is that our rail safety branch actually has a pretty strong tradition of safety that's continuous. In part, that's probably because they are out in the field. They do inspections. They're always looking at things. And they actually understood that there weren't too many facilities that were prepared at the beginning of last year to take the Bakken crudes. And they knew that there were going to have to be changes. To begin to figure out where to target, they went and looked at planning departments. Was anybody pulling a permit? Could they figure out where it was going to go? And they came up with 2 permits in the Bakersfield area that told them a lot about where they needed to focus their efforts and where they needed to actually force accelerated expenditures for safety improvements, where they needed to work with the local governments in terms of actually changing traffic patterns or looking at rail crossings, and to actually help them to prepare. They have built a very strong cooperative effort with the Office of Safety and OSPR and the Department of Fish and Game. Those are the folks who come and do remediation. We're the folks who do prevention. Part of their cooperative effort is to help actually start to look at trestles and bridges so that there's a better sense of where there's risk and hazard, as well as continuing to map along those lines where the first trains are going to arrive, where the unsafe curves are so they can increase their enforcement. But I think that we're just getting started in this. One of the challenges that we understand very well, and maybe Lisa can speak to this more, is that the regs for the stronger tank cars are still stuck in the Office of Management and Budget in D.C. We talked to our colleagues at the Federal Railway Administration. So one of the first visits I made to an out-of-state agency was to go talk to them about exactly these issues. And we need to get that moving. And so, Lisa, do you have anything you want to add to this? Okay.
Good. Well, as we go into budget, I want to make certain that you ask for the resources that you need in order to deal with this change.
We did you did very kindly add some positions last year. Yes. I think that some of what we need to think about is, are there better tools that we can use to actually monitor things real time? You know, I'm impressed by technology I've heard about from the railroads and from the Federal Railway Administration. The Federal Railway Administration has a train they can roll down the track that can actually take a sonic picture of the rail as it's rolling. So it's faster, of course, than walking it. It doesn't give you quite the same quality. You don't see all the cracks. You won't be able to detect some of the issues that you would if you were giving it a visual. But those are very expensive trains. And nor do we have job descriptions for people who operate that kind of equipment and state personnel. Nor do we actually operate trains at the CPUC. So there are real barriers for us to actually employ some of these new technologies. That's, I think, part of the purpose of continuing to work on the safety plan and a strategic planning process that comes back to you with some discussion of where we need to be in a few years so that you in the budget process can give us a go-ahead on those things. Is that fair?
Especially on bridges, bridge inspections, considering how many, and the at-grade crossing issue. So I thank you for that.
If you never have a chance, you should go down to Bakersfield and go on a tour with our guys. They're very passionate. They are very safety conscious. One of the first visits I made to a field office, and they, you know, one of the first things you warn you to do is not stand on the track because you get grease on your boots, potential for slip and fall. And so, of course, as a commissioner, I'm not observant of things that I've just been told. And I stood on the track. And what I noticed is even before I had a chance to catch myself, people were leaning in from around me to grab me and to pull me off the tracks. There's always somebody standing next to the tracks looking one direction. There's always somebody looking the other direction, just in case a train is approaching and people don't notice it. So I think that they're the model that we need to really start to rebuild into the entire organization. I'm really proud to be working with them.
Thank you for that. I wanted to ask again about an issue that is important to areas such as mine, which have a lot, small and medium-sized cities, but a lot of rural area, telecommunications and access to equal service, actually in the rural areas, it's a real problem getting this kind of access. With respect to the FCC's recent decision, very recent decision on open internet rules, I'm curious as to how you're going to proceed as a state. We are going to proceed as a state.
Well, Senator McGuire has already explored my boundless ignorance on telecommunication issues. It's the area that I know the least about. I think that overall we don't have a lot of authority, and it's not clear to me yet whether the FCC decision actually gives us any more authority. I just can't tell. And so our staff is actually starting to prepare some documents and analysis of the longer FCC that'll say, here's what changes for the CPUC.
Yes, I'd like to add the FCC operates in a way that's unfamiliar to California. First, they vote for the decision, and then they write it. So it actually hasn't been written yet, so no one really knows what's in it. This may take as long as 6 months before we get to see it. Then we would be able to answer your questions.
All right, thank you. I just have a couple more questions. You know my district. My district is always looking for alternatives to the IOUs. They just are, whether it's community choice aggregation, renewables, energy efficiency, distributed generation, the cutting edge, which is often the bleeding edge, but that's the district I represent. The difficulty has been always in, finding some kind of partnership with, in this case, PG&E, but with an IOU. And that also is the case when it comes to the governor's goals, which I think are important to try and meet. My district does as well, but we always don't have the partnership with the IOUs. Sort of from the 30,000-foot level, I'd like to hear what you have to say about that issue and how we can move many of these important energy issues forward.
Well, let me just sort of distinguish between how we make it easier for customers to take control of their own energy destiny and how the utilities serve people who don't really choose to get that engaged in their own energy choices. And so the low voltage distribution grid, the things that are kind of your neighborhood lines, anything below generally 110 kV to 65 kV is considered distribution. Everything above that is actually federally jurisdictional. And we're kind of going through a transition. This is when I talked to utility folks, when I was at the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, everybody told me that this is the most change that we've seen in the electric utility industry in California in the last 10 years in the previous 100 years. And probably one of the more significant things is we have a system that's designed to go from large power systems to one-way to the edges of cities where it gets stepped down, then to other substations where it gets stepped down again, to your neighborhood substation, and then to your feeder line. That's always been one way. When you make it two-way, it's a much more complicated thing. When you have people on one street who have, 50 kV of solar, but 2 blocks over on a different feeder line, you have somebody who has a 2 Tesla garage. The electricity actually has to go all the way back up the system to the place where there's a synchrophaser to actually go back down that other feeder line, or it has to come from outside. That's not a really rational or very efficient system. So the question is, what is the infrastructure that we need to build that actually makes it easy for people to make their own choices? I think that I describe this as plug and play. It's what you have with your office computer system. You plug another printer in. The Microsoft Exchange server says, oh, I know what kind of printer that is. Here's what we're going to name it. And it just works. You don't have to think about it. Similarly, at home, when you get your new Epson printer, you plug it in, and within 5 minutes, it's ready to go. How do we get to that stage? And this is a conversation we have a lot with the state of New York and with the state of Hawaii, because those are the 2 other states in the U.S. that have the most of these kinds of resources. We still have far more in our system than either of those 2 states, but they are the most interested in those questions that I was just outlining. Because we're more advanced, they're looking to us to figure out how does the system work when you put all these pieces together. How do you make it efficient? How do you actually have the infrastructure? And my guess is that at some point the utilities will become pure wires companies. They're just going to run the wires. They're going to manage the system. They're going to make sure that it actually gets the most efficient use of those two-way flows. If, as I'm starting to hear, that there are efforts to have third parties sell to third parties renewable resources across the grid directly to each other, then the utility is just going to be the body that actually tracks the transaction and then probably settles up the bills. And so that's a much different role, and that's not where we're at. And we have more resources invested in this system now in California than any other state. So it's a question, how do we maximize the current investment? We have more advanced metering infrastructure than any other state, which can help us in a lot of ways towards getting to that point that you talk about. We have actually spent another tranche of money on a different kind of equipment that actually gives us a lot of flexibility at the substation level. It's called the synchrophaser. That's the smart grid deployment. And the administrative law judge who actually prepared that action was sitting beside me. And now we're in the midst of what we call this distribution resource planning process. And it's actually going to take us the next step. It's part of the suite of requirements that the legislature asked us to look at in the AB 327 omnibus bill. I think that bill will actually set the stage, but we're doing things a bit more incrementally than New York, because they don't have the challenge of trying to jump over a couple of generations of technology. They have no advanced metering infrastructure. They don't have synchrophasers on most of their substations. So they're going to try to jump over that. I think at the end of the day, we have to really be attuned, however, still, to if we're going to start to reshape what the role of the utilities in this new kind of a vision, what keeps them making the system really run well. I think that there are a couple utilities who are looking at this very seriously. I'll just point to one utility from Southern California that bought a solar company, is competing to install rooftop solar here in Northern California. I think that you see that in some of the utilities' interest in actually moving into electric vehicle infrastructure. We have not yet completed our process on that, but when we did battery infrastructure, in the interest of bridging from the past to the future, we let the utilities prime the market with their cheap money by buying half of the electric infrastructure, and the third party, they have to go to private contractors, so that we build up an industry rather than simply building up the rate base of the utility. I think that these are all tough questions. I don't think anybody has the answer. When I talk to New York, they constantly saying, well, what prices are you getting? How do we figure out what our tariffs should be? What structure do you think a tariff should take for solar? How do we begin to cost the cost of new infrastructure? How do we fit that into the rates for customers? How do we make sure that it's fair? So I think it's an interesting time. As you can probably see, I know too much about it, but I'd be happy to talk to you more.
And my last comment or question has to do with ex parte communications. I want to thank the chair for delving into that, and I hear your commitment to really take a look at this issue. It's not just an issue of the PUC. In my view, it has to do with any of our agencies that actually adjudicate disputes. For example, the BOE, the Board of Equalization. There are some serious problems that, they do not have ex parte rules as a tax court would, and that's been a real problem on some of their decisions. And now we have a California Water Commission that has $2.7 billion and I think needs some ex parte rules. But I really want to ask you about whether or not whether you think the existing code is sufficient given the kinds of decisions you make that have those those financial consequences.
I'd be honest and say I don't know yet. That's why we have Mr. Stromwasser out looking at best practices. I want to understand better how other states do it. But recognizing a desire that we be accessible to many of the parties. One of the states that I'm familiar with, because I had conversations with other commissioners when I was a new commissioner, does not allow commissioners to talk to anybody about any proceeding. And that I think might actually not meet the California interests. And so I don't know if that's the way we would or should go. I think that I want to see what the other commissioners think about it. I'm very fortunate to have a new commissioner who actually knows and has thought about these things a long time. Leanne Randolph was the chair of the FPPC and was the legal counsel to the Coastal Commission. And she has a lot of observations too. I think what you will see from us is a public debate about that. And we will probably also come to the legislature for things that you probably need to change if we think that it makes sense. You may have ideas that will enter into our discussions as we try to frame a process. I know that various groups within the PUC, including the administrative law judges, have been thinking about this. So all I can really tell you is that I think I have ideas, but I don't know what the potential drawbacks are, and I don't want to tell you that I understand until we've had more discussion and I can have people challenge me in my ideas.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Anyone else have any questions? Mr. Hill?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the hearing today. I have a few questions, a couple of follow-ups to yours, Mr. Chair, and then I'd just like to kind of open with a thank you for the work that you've done in the short months that you've been there. A couple of areas. One, by really fostering the communication between commissioners, I think is during public hearings, taking Commissioner Farron, your predecessor's suggestions of developing the subcommittees. I think that's a healthy way to go and will open the dialogue so that you can all be on the same page and all be engaged and invested in that, in the process as it moves forward. I also want to recognize your focus on safety. It wasn't until you arrived that the PUC finally developed a safety policy, and that was nearly 4 years later and after safety became the buzzword at the PUC, so thank you for that. It would not have developed the 2015 Safety Action Plan without your assistance. I think that's clearly your leadership, and it's much appreciated by me and I believe all of us. Just to follow up a couple of questions from the chair on in the ex parte issue, I'm not going to ask. I know I have legislation. I think the chair has legislation, and there's other bills around them. Do you have some too? Oh, Senator Leno has some. Here's one. And there's a number of issues related to ex parte, and I know you're doing some good work related to getting into the meat of that and the heart of it to try and make it and craft it in the right way. I wanted to just on the issue of the defense counsel that you've retained. I think what for me at first blush when I saw it, and I think for most of the public, is you get the impression that this government agency is now hiding behind the law. That you're looking for reasons not to disclose, not to be transparent. I think that's the first response. An attorney would probably say, no, they're just protecting their rights and everyone is being protected. But I think that's the crux of the issue that we're looking at, and how you do that and maintain that transparency, and I think the disclosure, and almost I think people look at it, just let the court of public opinion make the decision at the end of the day as to how well you've done, and then that would reflect to the legislature to make whatever policies. The other issue, and then I've got some prepared questions, is related to emails. And the emails that the chair discussed or raised. You mentioned that your emails are, in 90 days, they go away from your device in the enterprise system that you have. Do you, and this is kind of based on what we've just learned in the last couple of days, our former First Lady and former Secretary of State, and the email system that she was using by the device that she was using, whether that was legal or illegal, do you and do other commissioners use solely for PUC business the enterprise PUC system that's provided to you?
I think pretty much. I received a Public Records Act request. I have to say we've had 220 Public Records Act requests since last fall. Some of them are larger than the 1.6 million documents that were requested by the state and federal lawyers. So it keeps us quite busy. I got one asking me whether I had any emails related to San Onofre on my private computer. And I looked and I disclosed them to our lawyers. They actually turned out only to be from people who I knew from local anti-nuclear work or from community activism asking me questions, but it was before I was at the PUC. So I disclosed them, and I don't think I've found anything else. And so, I would say I've not done a lot of work to check my emails and my phones, but I don't think I do that. I try to keep one phone for my father to call me, and then I have one for all the state business.
So then the practice at the PUC is that commissioners would use the state exchange system for emails, and perhaps when you look at, one of my questions is related to the code of conduct that you're working on, that perhaps that could be part of that code of conduct.
Well, that's a good suggestion, and I'll take you up on that. I assume that other commissioners do. The executive director is saying that it probably is policy, but I got to admit, I don't look at other people's emails.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's policy, but it is practice. When I need to reach a commissioner, I use their commission email. I have no other emails for them. We sort of have the opposite problem, people using the state email for private communications.
I would say that's a bigger problem for me too, my nephews. And
If I could, just a few questions. One on employee input, and it's not the legislature, but I think the PUC's own staff that has been most betrayed by management's treatment of the safety culture report that was done previously, and the recent email scandals at the PUC. I think the employees are the ones that have been most affected by that. You've stated that you intend the commissioners to develop that code of conduct and will solicit public input before finalizing it. Your employees, however, will probably not be making those public comments, and yet they're probably the best indicators as what the problem is. And based on that earlier safety culture report that was conducted, it really identified that they know best of what the challenges are. How do you plan to integrate the employee input into that code of conduct?
we're going to ask them to come and speak to it. We're going to provide them opportunities. We're going to have a strategic planning process where we can revisit some of those things. I don't expect that any of these things will be anything other than a living document, which I hope will grow and become stronger. So I don't think that we're going to miss opportunities. I think that our own internal discussions over what an ex parte code has already started to spread. I've asked that in my meetings with the ALJ division, and they have actually started to provide comments. So I think that as we start to talk to each other in public, and as we talk to people informally and encourage them to comment on these things, that we will get participation. As we have a strategic planning process where we start to talk about what our goal, our vision, our values, and our plans for the future are, that we'll get a robust response from staff.
And that'll also extend to the management staff that you have as well, not just the underlying.
I think our challenge is for some divisions tend to kind of say, okay, you tell me what to do. Other divisions have people who actually see themselves as decision makers. So I don't think we're going to have one process for each division that's really going to be successful or effective.
Okay, well, that is encouraging, obviously, because that 2013 employee survey wasn't released to the employees until after it was in the press, so it'll be a good part. We're
actually going to do another process on safety and safety culture with the Center for Catastrophic Risk Management to revisit those questions about safety, but I think we want to do it in a slightly more effective way, rather than just sending out a paper and having people check boxes. I think we really need to do deep interviews and get reactions and give them theses that they can respond to. So it's more of a dialogue and engagement, and to really deepen this sense that we're actually trying to have a dialogue with our employees rather than just lecture to them.